You humiliate me. I'm appalled by you, my daughter-in-law declared at my grandson's graduation dinner. I merely smiled. I had anticipated this moment. I signaled a waiter and a video began playing on the TV. I made the harridan collapse when I thought I'd seen it all. 2 marriages, 3 children, a lifetime of navigating the messy, beautiful, sometimes utterly brutal parts of human relationships. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment my daughter-in-law, with a viper's smile, tried to tear my family apart, right there, in front of everyone, at my grandson's graduation dinner. What she didn't know was, I had it all on tape. My grandson Elliot had just conquered the world. Harvard Law, a full scholarship. My heart was absolutely bursting. With pride as he sat at the head of our table in the Riverside Country Club. The dining room buzzed with that special kind of restrained excitement only graduation dinners bring. Crystal clinked, voices murmured congratulations, and my brilliant Elliot, sharp in his navy suit, beamed. Grandma Thelma, he leaned in, eyes shining. Did you see Professor Morrison's face when I gave my speech? I think I actually made him tear up. I squeezed his calloused hand, remembering the summers he'd spent on construction sites, helping to pay his way. You've always had a gift with words, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud. That's when the temperature in the room plummeted. Oh, please! The voice, Esme's voice, cut through our moment like a blade. Let's not pretend this is some fairy tale success story. All heads snapped towards her. Esme, my daughter-in-law, sat rigid in her chair, that particular smile she reserved for drawing blood already on her lips. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly I actually worried it would shatter. Esme, my son David warned, a desperate whisper, but she was already past the point of no return. She rose slowly, deliberately, her designer dress catching the chandelier light as she turned to face me. The conversations at nearby tables died down, people sensing the shift in our little corner of the room. You want to know what I really think about this whole charade? Her voice carried just enough, reaching the familiar faces from our social circle, all turning with barely concealed curiosity. This woman, she pointed directly at me, has been playing the devoted grandmother act for years. But the truth is she's nothing but an embarrassment. My stomach dropped. But I forced my face into careful neutrality. I'd learned long ago not to give Esme the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Mom, stop! David's voice held a note of desperation I'd heard too many times before, but Esme was just getting started. She took a step closer to my chair, her voice rising with each word. You want to know what your precious grandmother really is, Elliot? She's a fraud. A pathetic old woman who can't even dress appropriately for her own grandson's graduation dinner. I glanced down at my navy dress. Conservative, well-tailored, perfectly appropriate. But I knew deep down this wasn't really about my clothes. You embarrass me, Esme continued, her voice now carrying to half the dining room. Every single time we're in public together, I have to pretend that you're not a complete social disaster. You say the wrong things, you dress like you shop at thrift stores, and you have no idea how to conduct yourself around people who matter. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on our table, could practically hear the whispered conversations that would dominate the country club for weeks. Elliot's face had gone paper white. Esme, that's enough, David pleaded. No, it's not enough. She whirled back to me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that went beyond mere dislike. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. I have carried the embarrassment of being associated with you for 15 years. 15 years of making excuses, of trying to minimize the damage you caused just by existing in our lives. She leaned down closer to me, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than her shouting. You disgust me, Thelma. I look at you and I feel sick to my stomach that you're supposed to be family. The words hit me like physical blows. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of the shame and hurt I might have expected, a calm settled over me. A peaceful, almost pleasant calm. I smiled. It wasn't a big, dramatic smile, just a small, satisfied curve of my lips that seemed to confuse Esme more than any tears or protests might have. With steady hands, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I caught the eye of Marcus, our usual waiter, and gave him a subtle nod. What are you doing? Esme demanded, some of her confidence wavering as she noticed my composure. I didn't answer. I just watched as Marcus moved to the small control panel near the bar where the restaurant's ambient music system was managed. The soft jazz faded out, replaced by the distinctive sound of a video beginning to play. The large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall, usually displaying the club's weekly events calendar, flickered to life with a different image entirely. Esme turned toward the screen, and I watched the color drain from her face like water flowing down a drain. "No," she whispered. But yes, there she was, crystal clear in high definition, sitting in what was clearly a lawyer's office. The timestamp showed a date from just 6 months ago. "So you want to completely sever all ties?" The lawyer's voice came through the restaurant sound system with perfect clarity. "Completely," Esme replied on screen. "I don't want her to have any legal claim to contact or visitation. As far as I'm concerned, I never had a daughter." The blood left Esme's face so quickly I thought she might faint right there. She stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table for support. "What is this?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. On screen, the conversation continued. "And you understand that this means she'll have no support system? No family connection at all?" "Good," Esme's recorded voice replied coldly. "Maybe that will finally teach her that actions have consequences." That's when Esme's knees gave out entirely. She collapsed into her chair with such force that it slid backward, and then she simply folded forward onto the table, unconscious. The dining room erupted in whispers and gasps, but I remained perfectly still, watching the video continue to play. Watching my daughter-in-law's deepest secret broadcast to everyone who mattered in her carefully constructed social world. I had been waiting for this moment for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Ever since the private investigator I'd hired delivered that recording to my kitchen table, along with a manila folder full of other materials that had made my hands shake with rage. Tonight, finally, everyone would know what Esme really was. 4 months earlier, I was arranging flowers in my kitchen when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but at my age, unexpected visitors usually meant either someone selling something I didn't need or a neighbor with gossip I probably didn't want to hear. The man at my door looked nothing like what I'd expected a private investigator would look like. Raymond Torres was in his 50s, wearing a simple gray suit that had seen better days, carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested he'd been in this business for a long time. His handshake was firm but gentle, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much of humanity's darker side. "Mrs. Caldwell," his voice was careful, professional. "I believe you're expecting me." I had hired him 3 weeks earlier after a conversation with my neighbor, Dorothy, had planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't shake. She'd mentioned seeing Esme at a law office downtown, which seemed odd since Esme had never mentioned any legal matters to the family. "Dorothy's cousin works as a receptionist there," she'd said. "Family law practice, family law." My stomach had clenched. "Please come in," I offered, leading him to my kitchen table, the same table where I'd made the call to hire him, my hands trembling as I dialed the number I'd found online. Raymond set his briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "I have to tell you, Mrs. Caldwell, what I found was more extensive than what you originally asked me to investigate." My stomach tightened. I'd asked him to look into why Esme might be visiting a lawyer. I hadn't prepared myself for extensive. "Before I show you anything," he continued, pulling out a thick manila folder, "I need you to understand that once you see this, you can't unsee it. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss." I looked at the folder, then back at his weathered face. "Mr. Torres," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been married twice, buried one husband, and survived raising 3 children largely on my own. I've learned that the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than living with a beautiful lie." He nodded slowly and opened the folder. The first document was a legal petition dated 18 months earlier. As I read the header, my vision actually blurred for a moment. "Petition for termination of parental rights. Voluntary surrender." "She has another daughter," Raymond said quietly. "Madison Phillips. She's 23 now." My hand started shaking before I'd finished reading the first paragraph. Esme had voluntarily terminated her parental rights to a daughter from a previous relationship, not because she was young and unprepared, not because of financial hardship. The petition clearly stated she was terminating her rights because she was moving forward with a new family unit and wished to avoid complications. It wasn't just abandonment. It was erasure. "There's more," Raymond said, and I wasn't sure I could handle more. The next document was a report from a social worker. Madison had been 15 when Esme abandoned her, left in the care of an elderly grandmother who died just 2 years later. The girl had aged out of the foster system with no family support, no college fund, No safety net of any kind. Where is she now? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Working 2 jobs in downtown Portland, trying to finish community college. She's been completely on her own since she was 17. I stared at the photo Raymond handed me. Madison had Elliot's eyes, the same warm brown that came from my son David's side of the family. She had Esme's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own. An awareness, a strength that spoke of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be a cold and unforgiving place. She doesn't know about your family, Raymond continued. As far as Madison is concerned, her mother disappeared from her life and never looked back. She has no idea that Esme remarried and had the life that Madison never got to have. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was learning. How did you find all this? Public records mostly. Court documents are accessible if you know where to look. I also spoke to some people who knew them before Esme left Portland. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Mrs. Caldwell, there's something else you need to know about why she left. I wasn't sure I could take another revelation, but I nodded for him to continue. Madison was getting too old, too independent, starting to ask questions about her father, wanting to know more about her mother's past. According to her former neighbors, Esme seemed to view Madison as a liability rather than a daughter, someone who might interfere with her plans to start fresh. The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about Elliot, about how much love and pride Esme showed him in public. Had that all been a performance? Was she capable of loving any child, or was Elliot just young enough still to be useful to her image? There's video, Raymond said quietly. Video? I was able to obtain footage from the law office security cameras. Your daughter-in-law was very explicit about her intentions and her feelings toward Madison during her meeting with the attorney. That's when he handed me the USB drive that would change everything. I watched it that night alone in my living room, curtains drawn, door locked. Watching Esme sit in that lawyer's office and speak about her own daughter with such cold detachment made me physically ill. She talked about Madison like she was disposing of an unwanted piece of furniture. But it was more than just the abandonment that horrified me. It was the calculation behind it. Esme had researched the legal process thoroughly. She'd made sure there would be no way for Madison to contact her in the future. No way for her past to interfere with her new life with David and Elliot. She had erased her own daughter with the same casual efficiency that someone might delete old files from a computer. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Madison, working 2 jobs, putting herself through school with no family support. I thought about Elliot, the grandson Esme doted on so publicly, and wondered what would happen if he ever became inconvenient to her image. But mostly, I thought about my son, David, who had no idea he'd married a woman capable of abandoning her own child. I knew I had to do something, but what? How do you tell your son that his wife is not who she pretends to be? How do you explain that the woman he loves discarded her own daughter like trash? More importantly, how do you make sure it never happens again? That's when I started planning. I hired Raymond to find Madison, to learn everything he could about her current situation. I discovered she was struggling but determined, working as a night shift security guard and a weekend barista to pay for her classes. She lived in a studio apartment that cost most of her income, but she was making it work through sheer force of will. I also had Raymond continue monitoring Esme's activities. I wanted to know if there were other secrets, other victims of her particular brand of cold calculation. What he found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Esme had done this before, not abandoned children. Madison was her only child before David. But she had systematically isolated herself from anyone who knew her past, anyone who might contradict the image she wanted to project. Former friends, distant relatives, even her own mother, all cut off without explanation once they were no longer useful to her carefully constructed persona. My daughter-in-law was not just selfish or self-centered. She was a predator who specialized in emotional manipulation, and my family was her current hunting ground. I spent weeks agonizing over what to do with this information. Should I tell David immediately? Should I contact Madison? Should I confront Esme directly? But then I remembered something my first husband used to say. The best way to catch a liar is to let them keep talking. So I waited. I watched. I documented. And I started planning for the day when Esme would finally reveal her true nature to everyone who mattered. I didn't have to wait long. The video continued playing as Esme lay unconscious, her head resting on the white tablecloth like she'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of her own destruction. The restaurant staff had moved quickly to clear the nearby tables, but not quickly enough to prevent half the country club from witnessing my daughter-in-law's most carefully guarded secret. On screen, Esme's voice continued with that same cold detachment I'd heard when Raymond first played this recording for me. I don't want her to be able to find me, ever. As far as the world is concerned, Madison Phillips is not my daughter. David sat frozen in his chair, staring at the screen like he was watching a foreign film without subtitles. His face had gone through several color changes in the past few minutes, from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. Dad? Elliot's voice was small, uncertain. Who is Madison Phillips? Before David could answer, Esme's eyes fluttered open. She lifted her head slowly, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, looking around the dining room like she couldn't quite remember where she was. Then her gaze landed on the television screen, and reality crashed back into her face like a physical blow. "Turn it off!" she whispered, then louder, more frantic. "Turn it off!" She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and lunged toward the television controls. But Marcus, our waiter, stepped smoothly between her and the screen. He looked to me, and I gave him the slightest shake of my head. "Please." Esme turned to face our table, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled from her collapse. This is out of context. You don't understand." "Then explain it to us." My voice was calm, steady. The voice of someone who'd had months to prepare for this moment. "Who is Madison Phillips, Esme?" The question hung in the air like smoke around us. I could feel the weight of dozens of conversations that had stopped mid-sentence, the electricity of social drama that would be dissected in living rooms across the city for months to come. Esme's voice cracked. She looked desperately at David, searching his face for some sign that he might still be on her side. "She's my daughter. From before I met your father." "Your daughter?" David's voice was flat, emotionless. "You have a daughter?" "I had a daughter," Esme corrected quickly. "It was a long time ago, before you and I got together. It was complicated, David. You don't understand what my life was like then." On screen, the lawyer's voice continued the conversation we were all hearing for the first time. "And you're certain you want to include the clause preventing any future contact?" "This is quite permanent, Miss Phillips." "Completely certain," Esme's recorded voice replied. "I want a clean slate. No complications from my past." Elliot pushed his chair back from the table. "How old was she when you did this?" Esme's eyes darted between her son and her husband. "She was 15, but you have to understand, 15? The word exploded from David like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You abandoned a 15-year-old? "I didn't abandon her." Esme's voice rose defensively. "She had her grandmother. She had a support system. I just couldn't handle being a mother at that point in my life." I watched this exchange with the detached fascination of someone observing a carefully planned experiment. For months, I'd wondered how Esme would explain herself when confronted with the truth. I'd imagined various scenarios, different excuses she might use. I hadn't expected her to be quite this clumsy about it. "But you could handle being a mother to me?" Elliot's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I'd never heard before. "What made me different?" The question clearly caught Esme off guard. She opened and closed her mouth several times before managing, "That's different." "You're different. How?" "You just are." Her voice was getting higher, more frantic. "Elliot, you have to understand. I was young when I had Madison. I wasn't ready. But when I met your father, when we had you, I was in a completely different place in my life. I decided it was time to speak up." "Actually, Esme, according to the court documents, you were 28 when you signed away your rights to Madison. Hardly a child yourself." The silence that followed my words was so complete, I could hear the kitchen staff clattering dishes in the back of the restaurant. David turned to look at me for the first time since the video began. "You knew about this?" "I found out 4 months ago." I met his gaze steadily. "I hired a private investigator after I saw Esme coming out of a law office downtown. I wanted to know what she was hiding." "You had me investigated." Esme's voice pitched higher. "You violated my privacy. You had no right." "I had every right." My voice cut through her protest like a blade. "You married my son. You became part of my family. And something about you never felt right." The video on screen was reaching its conclusion, but the lawyer's final question hung in the air like a judgment. And what should we do if Madison Phillips ever tries to contact you in the future? I'm dead. The gasp that went up from the nearby tables was audible. Even some of the restaurant staff stopped what they were doing to stare at our table. Elliot's face had gone completely pale. You wanted her to think you were dead? It was kinder that way, Esme said desperately. Don't you see? It was better for her to have a clean break, to be able to move on without wondering why I left. This way, she could grieve and heal instead of spending her life hoping I'd come back. That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard, David said quietly. Selfish? Esme whirled on him. I was trying to protect her. I was trying to do what was best for everyone. No, I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria with quiet authority. You were trying to protect yourself. You wanted to start fresh with David and Elliot, and Madison was an inconvenience. That's not true. Then where is she now, Esme? I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, where I'd pulled up a recent photo Raymond had taken of Madison leaving her night job. Where is this daughter you were supposedly protecting? Esme stared at the photo, and for a moment, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across her face. Madison looked tired in the picture, wearing a security guard uniform, walking to her car in an empty parking lot at 3 a.m. Esme's voice faltered. She's working 2 jobs to put herself through community college, I continued. She lives in a studio apartment that costs 3/4 of her income. She has no family, no support system, no safety net of any kind, because her mother decided she was an inconvenience. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. On the screen, the video had finally ended, replaced by the country club's usual events calendar as if nothing had happened. David stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone who wasn't sure his legs would support him. I need to leave. David, wait. Esme reached for his arm, but he stepped away from her touch. Don't, he said quietly. Just don't, he turned to Elliot. Son, are you coming with me? Elliot looked between his parents, confusion and hurt warring across his young face. Finally, he nodded and stood up. This isn't over, Esme said, her voice taking on a hard edge as she watched her family preparing to leave her sitting alone. You think you've won something here, Thelma? You think destroying my marriage makes you the hero? I gathered my purse and stood to follow my son and grandson. Before I left, I turned back to face her one last time. I didn't destroy your marriage, Esme. I just made sure your husband knew who he was really married to. As we walked through the dining room toward the exit, I could feel dozens of eyes following our progress. Tomorrow, this story would spread through every social circle that mattered to Esme. Her carefully constructed image as the perfect wife and mother would be replaced by the truth about who she really was. But as satisfying as that thought was, I knew this was just the beginning. Esme wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and she still had weapons she hadn't used yet. The real battle was just starting. The first shot in Esme's counterattack came exactly 48 hours after the restaurant incident, delivered in the form of a heartbroken phone call from my youngest daughter, Sarah, who lived 3 states away. Mom, what's going on? Sarah's voice was tight with concern. Esme called me this morning crying. She said you've been trying to destroy her marriage for months. I was in my garden, deadheading roses in the early morning quiet when my phone rang. The peace of the morning shattered with my daughter's words, and I sat down heavily on my garden bench. She said, what? She told me you hired someone to spy on her, that you ambushed her at Elliot's graduation dinner with some kind of setup. Mom, she was sobbing. She said you're trying to turn the whole family against her because you've never accepted her. The careful way Sarah spoke told me everything I needed to know. Esme had gotten to her first, had painted herself as the victim and me as the villain. I could practically hear the script my daughter-in-law had used, probably the same one she was spreading to anyone who would listen. Sarah, there's more to this story than what Esme told you. I know you two have never gotten along perfectly, but Mom, she said you violated her privacy. She said you had her followed. Did you really do that? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of having to defend actions that shouldn't need defending. Yes, I did, but not for the reasons she told you. Then why? How do you explain to your daughter that her brother's wife is a predator? How do you tell her that the woman who's been part of family gatherings for 15 years casually abandoned her own child? She has another daughter, Sarah, a daughter she abandoned when the girl was 15 years old. Silence on the other end of the line, then quietly, what? Her name is Madison. She's 23 now. working 2 jobs to put herself through community college with no family support because Esme legally severed all ties with her. She made sure Madison could never contact her again. Another long pause. Are you sure? I have court documents, video recordings, everything. But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into Sarah's voice. Mom, that seems extreme. Even for someone you don't like. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? And there it was. The seed Esme had planted was already taking root. My own daughter was questioning my judgment, my motives, my version of events. This was how Esme operated. I'd learned that much from Raymond's investigation. She didn't just abandon people. She systematically destroyed their credibility first, making sure that when the truth came out, it would be dismissed as the vindictive lies of someone with an agenda. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky and thinking about warfare. Most people think battles are won with dramatic gestures, big moments of triumph. But Esme understood something more sophisticated. She knew that the most effective way to win a war was to make your enemy defeat themselves. By the time my neighbor Dorothy came by for our usual afternoon tea, I'd received similar calls from 2 cousins, David's sister Michelle, and even Elliot's girlfriend Jennifer. All of them had heard some version of the same story. Poor Esme, victimized by a bitter mother-in-law who couldn't accept that her son had found happiness. I don't want to take sides, Dorothy said carefully as she settled into my kitchen chair with her cup of Earl Grey. But people are talking, Thelma, and some of what they're saying, well, it doesn't make you look very good. What exactly are they saying? Dorothy shifted uncomfortably. That you've been jealous of Esme from the beginning, that you resented how happy she made David, how perfect their family seemed. They're saying you hired that investigator to dig up dirt on her. And when you couldn't find anything really damaging, you took things out of context to make her look bad. Out of context? I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. Dorothy, she abandoned her 15-year-old daughter. She legally erased her own child. How is that out of context? Well, Dorothy said slowly, according to what I heard, the girl was troubled, acting out, getting into drugs maybe. And Esme was young and scared, and thought the girl would be better off with other family members who could handle her better. I stared at my oldest friend, watching her repeat Esme's lies with the conviction of someone who wanted to believe them. Where did you hear that version? Esme called me yesterday. She was so upset, Thelma. She said she'd been planning to tell David about Madison when the time was right, but you forced her hand by making it public. She said the whole situation was more complicated than it looked. Of course Esme had called Dorothy. She was working her way through my entire support system, rewriting history, conversation by conversation. Did she mention that Madison has been completely on her own since she was 17? That she aged out of foster care with no family support? Dorothy frowned. She said the girl chose to cut contact with the family. That Madison was angry about the custody arrangement and refused to maintain relationships. Lies, wrapped in just enough plausible detail to sound credible. Esme had clearly spent the last 2 days crafting a narrative that transformed her from predator to victim, from abandoner to abandoned. The really masterful part was how she'd positioned my investigation as the real betrayal. By focusing on my violation of privacy rather than what that investigation had uncovered, she'd made me the villain in my own story. That evening, David called. Mom, we need to talk. His voice was careful, controlled, in a way that made my stomach clench. This wasn't the voice of a son calling his mother. This was the voice of someone who'd been convinced he needed to manage a difficult situation. Of course, sweetheart. Do you want to come over for dinner? Actually, I think it would be better if we met somewhere neutral. How about that coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow at 2? Neutral. As if I were some kind of threat that needed to be contained in a public space. The next afternoon, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. David walked in exactly at 2, and the way he moved, purposeful, resigned, told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I'd hoped for. He sat down across from me without ordering anything, his hands folded on the table like he was preparing to deliver bad news. Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since graduation night. I imagine you have. The thing is, what you did, having Esme investigated, ambushing her in public like that, it wasn't right. No matter what you found out, that wasn't the way to handle it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. And what would have been the right way, David? You should have come to me privately. We could have talked about it as a family, worked through whatever issues you had with my wife. Issues I had? I repeated carefully. David, this isn't about me not liking Esme. This is about her abandoning her own child. According to Esme, the situation with Madison was more complicated than what you saw in that video. She said she was trying to do what was best for a troubled teenager, and that you deliberately took her words out of context to make her look as bad as possible. There it was. The rewritten history delivered by my own son with the earnest conviction of someone who desperately wanted to believe it. Did she also tell you that Madison has been working 2 jobs to survive? That she has no family support system at all? David's jaw tightened. She told me that Madison chose to cut off contact with the family, that she was angry about the custody situation and refused to accept help. And you believe that? I believe my wife, he said firmly. And frankly, Mom, the fact that you went to such lengths to dig up her past makes me question your motives. I stared at my son, seeing Esme's handiwork written across his face like graffiti. She'd taken his natural loyalty and twisted it into a weapon against me. My motives? I kept my voice level, but inside I was screaming. David, I was trying to protect this family. From what? From a woman who made some difficult decisions as a young mother? From someone who was trying to start fresh and build a better life? From someone who is capable of abandoning her own child when that child becomes inconvenient? You don't know that's what happened. I know exactly what happened. I have the documentation. Documentation that you obtained by violating her privacy and trust. David leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard directed at me. Mom, I need you to understand something. Esme is my wife. She's the mother of my son, and what you did to her was cruel and vindictive. The words hit me like physical blows. My own son, the child I'd raised and sacrificed for, was defending the woman who'd erased her own daughter from existence. So what happens now? I asked quietly. Now we all try to move forward. Esme has agreed to consider family counseling to work through the issues that led to this situation, but she needs to know that she's safe from future attacks. Attacks? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She's afraid of you, Mom. She's afraid of what else you might try to do to hurt her. Esme. Afraid of me. The woman who'd systematically destroyed a teenage girl's life was afraid of a 67-year-old grandmother who'd simply exposed the truth. And what about Madison? I asked. David's expression softened slightly. If what you say about her situation is true, then maybe we can find a way to help her. But that's something Esme and I need to decide together, as a family. As a family. The phrase stung because it made clear exactly where I stood in this new dynamic. I was no longer part of the inner circle. I was now an outsider whose opinion might be consulted, but whose judgment was no longer trusted. As David left that coffee shop, I realized that Esme had won the first round of this war more decisively than I'd imagined possible. She hadn't just survived my revelation. She'd used it to isolate me from my own family. But what she didn't understand was that I'd been fighting battles longer than she'd been alive, and I wasn't nearly finished yet. 2 weeks after my devastating coffee shop conversation with David, I was in my kitchen making dinner for one when the doorbell rang. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Since the graduation dinner incident, my social calendar had become notably lighter as people in my circle tried to navigate the awkward waters of choosing sides in a family drama they didn't fully understand. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a young woman who took my breath away. She had David's eyes and Esme's delicate bone structure, but there was something in her expression that was entirely her own. A quiet strength mixed with nervous determination. Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Madison Phillips. I think we need to talk. My legs nearly gave out. After months of investigating her life from a distance, seeing her standing on my doorstep felt surreal, like a character from a book had stepped into reality. Madison, I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. How did you find me? It wasn't easy. She shifted a worn backpack on her shoulder. But when someone hires a private investigator to look into your life, word eventually gets back to you, especially in a city as small as Portland. Of course. Raymond had been discreet, but not invisible. In my focus on gathering information about Madison, I hadn't considered that she might become aware of the investigation. I know this is strange, she continued, but I drove down from Portland because I had to understand why someone was asking questions about me. And what I learned, she paused, her voice catching slightly. What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing. Please, come in. Can I get you something to eat? You must be tired from the drive. Coffee would be great, if you have it. As I busied myself with making coffee, Madison stood in my kitchen, looking around with curious eyes. She was smaller than I'd expected from Raymond's photos, probably barely 5'3", but there was a presence about her that filled the room. So you're Esme's mother-in-law, she said finally. I am. And you're her daughter. Apparently, the word came out bitter, though I spent the last 8 years believing she was dead. I nearly dropped the coffee pot. What? Madison sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Raymond had first shown me the documents that exposed Esme's lies. When I aged out of foster care, I tried to find her. I hired a cheap investigator with money I'd saved from my first job. He came back and told me my mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The coffee maker gurgled in the silence that followed her words. I felt like I was drowning in the enormity of what she was telling me. He showed me a death certificate and everything. Said he'd tracked down her last known address and found records of her death. I grieved for her, Mrs. Caldwell. I spent 3 years going to therapy to work through my feelings about losing a mother I'd barely known. But she wasn't dead. No, she was here, playing happy family with your son and grandson, while I was working night shifts to pay for community college classes. Madison's voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. Do you know what it's like to be told your mother died, and then find out she paid someone to make you believe she was dead? The room spun slightly as the full scope of Esme's cruelty hit me. It wasn't enough for her to abandon Madison. She'd had to make sure the girl could never find her, never disrupt her new life. How did you find out the truth? Your investigator was good, but not perfect. When he started asking questions in Portland, it got back to the woman who used to clean my grandmother's house. She remembered me, remembered my situation. She also remembered that my mother had paid her to spread the story about the car accident if anyone ever came looking. I sat down heavily across from Madison, feeling physically sick. She paid someone to fake her own death? A few hundred to make sure her past stayed buried. Madison's laugh was hollow. Cheaper than child support, I guess. Madison, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she'd gone that far. It's not your fault. Madison studied my face carefully. But I need to understand why you were investigating me. What does my mother's abandoned daughter have to do with your family? So I told her everything. About the private investigator, about the video, about the confrontation at the restaurant. I told her about David's refusal to believe the truth, about how Esme had managed to paint herself as the victim in her own story. When I finished, Madison sat quietly for a long time, processing what I'd shared. She has a son, she said finally. My half-brother, Elliot. He's 22, just graduated from Harvard Law School, and he doesn't know about me. He does now. He was there when the video played. Madison nodded slowly. What did he say? He was shocked, confused. But Esme has been working very hard to control the narrative since then. She's convinced most of the family that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Complicated how? I hesitated, not wanting to repeat Esme's lies. But Madison needed to know what she was up against. She's telling people you were troubled, that you had substance abuse issues and were acting out. She's saying she made the difficult decision to let you be raised by family members who could better handle your problems. Madison's coffee cup hit the table with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. Substance abuse? Acting out? Her voice rose with indignation. Mrs. Caldwell, I was 15 years old and my mother disappeared from my life without explanation. My grandmother was 78 and had arthritis so bad she could barely take care of herself. I was getting A's in school and working a part-time job to help pay for groceries. I know, I've seen your school records. Then you know she's lying. I do. But unfortunately, my family seems more inclined to believe her version. Madison stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the garden where I'd been working when Sarah called to tell me about Esme's damage control campaign. I want to meet them, she said finally. Who? My half-brother, your son. I want them to hear the truth from me directly. My stomach clenched with worry. Madison, I don't think that's a good idea. Esme has had weeks to prepare them for something like this. She'll have an explanation ready. Then I guess we'll see how convincing her explanations are when I'm standing right, there to contradict them. There was something in Madison's voice that reminded me of myself at her age. A quiet determination that wouldn't be swayed by other people's comfort or convenience. "What do you want from this?" I asked gently. "What are you hoping to accomplish?" Madison turned back to face me, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "I want my half-brother to know that I exist. I want him to know that our mother is capable of erasing her own children when they become inconvenient. And I want to make sure it never happens to him." The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like dust after an explosion. Madison wasn't here for revenge or money or even necessarily for reconciliation. She was here to protect a brother she'd never met from a mother who'd already proven she was capable of the unthinkable. "There's a family barbecue this Saturday," I said slowly, "at David and Esme's house. It's supposed to be a healing gathering, to bring everyone together after the restaurant incident. Will you take me?" I thought about David's anger, about Esme's carefully constructed victim narrative, about the way my own family had turned against me in the space of a few weeks. "Yes," I said, "I'll take you." Because sometimes the only way to fight a lie is to drag the truth into the same room and let them battle it out face to face. The next Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that makes everything feel heavy and uncertain. Madison had driven down from Portland again, this time with a small suitcase, prepared to stay through the weekend if necessary. We sat in my car outside David's house for several minutes, watching through the windows as my family moved around inside, preparing for their healing gathering. "Are you ready for this?" I asked Madison. She smoothed down her simple blue dress, the kind of outfit someone wears when they want to look respectable, but can't afford anything fancy. "No, but I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well get it over with." I knocked on the front door instead of using my key, a small acknowledgement that my status in this house had changed. When David opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally, a carefully controlled neutrality. "Mom, I wasn't sure you were coming." "I brought someone I'd like you to meet," I said, stepping aside so he could see Madison clearly. David's eyes widened as he took in her familiar features. Even someone determined to disbelieve the truth couldn't miss the family resemblance. "This is Madison Phillips," I said clearly. "Your stepdaughter." For a moment, David just stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at the young woman on his doorstep, who shared his son's eyes and his wife's bone structure. "Hello," Madison said simply. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." From somewhere behind David, I heard a glass shatter against the kitchen floor, followed by Esme's voice calling out in false cheerfulness, "David, who's at the door?" "I think," Madison said quietly, "it's time for a real family reunion." The moment Madison stepped into David's living room, the carefully orchestrated healing gathering transformed into something else entirely. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as relatives who'd been debating my version of events for weeks found themselves face-to-face with living proof of Esme's deception. Esme stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel still in her hands from cleaning up whatever she'd dropped when she heard Madison's name. Her face had gone completely white, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely scared. "Madison?" Elliot's voice came from the couch where he'd been sitting with his girlfriend, Jennifer. He stood up slowly, studying the young woman beside me with obvious fascination. You're my sister?" "Half-sister?" Madison corrected gently. "But yes." The resemblance between them was unmistakable now that they were in the same room. Both had inherited David's warm brown eyes and expressive eyebrows, though Madison's were more defined from years of careful grooming on a tight budget. "I don't understand," David said, his voice strained. "Madison, if you're really Esme's daughter, why didn't you contact us before now?" Madison's laugh was soft but bitter. "Because until 2 weeks ago, I thought my mother was dead." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the kitchen. Around the room, family members who'd spent weeks choosing sides found themselves recalibrating everything they thought they knew. "That's not possible," Esme finally managed, her voice high and thin. "Madison, sweetheart, you know that's not true. You were angry when I remarried, and you chose to cut contact with me." "No," Madison said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was 15 years old when you signed papers terminating your parental rights. I was 17 when I aged out of foster care with no family support. And I was 20 when I hired an investigator to find you, only to be told you died in a car accident." She pulled a folder from her backpack and handed it to David. These are copies of all the documents. The court papers you signed, the fake death certificate someone provided to the investigator I hired, even receipts showing payments made to ensure that story would hold up if anyone came looking. David's hand shook as he opened the folder. I watched his face change as he read through the evidence of his wife's systematic deception. You paid someone to fake your own death? His voice was barely above a whisper. David, you have to understand, Esme said desperately, moving toward him with her hands outstretched. The situation was complicated. Madison was going through a difficult phase, and I thought, I was getting straight A's, Madison interrupted, her voice cutting through Esme's fabrication like a knife. I was working a part-time job to help my elderly grandmother pay for groceries. The only thing I was going through was trying to understand why my mother disappeared from my life without explanation. She turned to address the room, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't come here for money or revenge or to break up anyone's family. I came here because I discovered that my mother, who I grieved for 3 years believing she was dead, has been living a completely different life while I struggled to survive on my own. Elliot stepped closer to her, his young face serious with the weight of understanding. What has your life been like? Since she left? Madison met his eyes steadily. I've worked 2 jobs for the past 5 years to put myself through community college. I live in a studio apartment that costs most of my income. I've had no family support, no safety net, no one to call when things got difficult. She paused, her voice softening. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. Oh, sweetheart. My sister-in-law Michelle spoke up from across the room, her voice full of genuine sympathy. We had no idea. Because you were never meant to know, Madison replied. My mother made sure of that. Esme was backing toward the kitchen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. You don't understand, she kept repeating. None of you understand how complicated the situation was. Then explain it to us, David said, his voice hard. Explain how abandoning a 15-year-old and then faking your own death was the right thing to do. She wasn't my responsibility anymore. Esme's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. I had a new life, a new family. I couldn't have my past following me around, complicating things. The honesty of that statement hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually stepped back as if Esme's words were contaminated. So you just erased her, Elliot said quietly. You erased your own daughter. I did what I had to do. Esme's voice was rising to a near shriek. You think it was easy? You think I wanted to give up my child? But I had to choose between my past and my future. And I chose my future. You chose yourself, Madison said with devastating simplicity. You chose your own comfort over your child's well-being. David set the folder down on the coffee table and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but complete recognition of who she really was. Get out, he said quietly. David, please. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get away from my family. Your family? Esme's voice turned vicious. Half of everything in this house is mine. Half of your assets, half of your retirement. You can't just throw me out. Actually, David said with grim satisfaction, I can. The prenup you insisted on works both ways, Esme. If either spouse commits fraud or engages in behavior that materially misrepresents their character, the marriage can be dissolved with no financial obligations. Esme's face went pale. You wouldn't. Abandoning your child and faking your own death to hide it from your new family seems like material misrepresentation to me, David continued. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings. I watched Esme look around the room, searching for even one sympathetic face. She found none. Even the relatives who'd been most willing to give her the benefit of the doubt were now staring at her with undisguised revulsion. You'll regret this, she said finally, her voice low and dangerous. All of you? You have no idea what you're throwing away. A liar and a child abandoner, Madison spoke up. I think we'll manage. After Esme left, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows, the family spent the rest of the evening getting to know Madison. She told them about her life in Portland, about her job as a night security guard, and her dreams of becoming a social worker. She showed them pictures of the small apartment she was so proud of, the first place that had ever truly belonged to her. But what struck me most was how naturally she fit into our family dynamic. She had David's dry sense of humor and his practical approach to problems. She shared Elliot's love of books and his quiet intensity when discussing things that mattered to her. Watching my grandson and his half-sister discover their connection was like watching two pieces of a puzzle finally click into place. "I can't believe I have a sister," Elliot said at one point, shaking his head in wonder. "Half-sister," Madison corrected again, but she was smiling. "Sister," he insisted. "The half part is just biology. Sisters are about choice." 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner for a larger crowd than I'd cooked for in years. Madison had transferred to a school closer to us, and David was helping her with tuition. Elliot had convinced her to move into the guest room at his apartment, claiming he needed a study partner for the bar exam. The divorce had been finalized with surprising speed once David's lawyer presented evidence of Esme's deception. She disappeared from our lives as thoroughly as she'd once disappeared from Madison's, leaving behind only the memories of the damage she'd tried to inflict. But perhaps the most satisfying change was in my relationship with my family. The crisis had stripped away all the polite pretenses and careful social maneuvering that had characterized our interactions for years. We were closer now, more honest with each other, more willing to have difficult conversations. "Grandma Thelma!" Madison appeared in my kitchen doorway holding a bottle of wine. "David sent me to ask if you need help with anything." I smiled at the title she'd chosen for me. Not Mrs. Caldwell, not Thelma, but Grandma. A designation that acknowledged her place in our family structure while respecting the relationship she'd built with my son and grandson. "I think we're almost ready," I said, checking the roast in the oven. "How are you settling in at school?" "Better than I expected." She leaned against the counter, relaxed in a way I'd never seen during those first tense meetings. "It's strange having people who care about whether I succeed or fail. I'm still getting used to it. Good strange or bad strange?" "Definitely good." She paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for everything. For investigating, for confronting her, for bringing me into this family. I know it wasn't easy." I studied her face, seeing not just the young woman she'd become, but glimpses of the frightened 15-year-old who'd been abandoned. The determined 17-year-old who'd aged out of foster care. The hopeful 20-year-old who'd grieved for a mother who was never really dead. "You did the hard part," I told her. "You survived. You built a life for yourself with no help from anyone. All I did was make sure the truth came to light." "All you did," Madison repeated with a smile, "was save me from spending the rest of my life believing I wasn't worth loving." From the dining room, I could hear David and Elliot debating something with the passionate intensity that seemed to run in our family. The sound of their voices, now joined by Madison's laugh, filled my house with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Esme had tried to erase Madison from existence, to protect her perfect life from the inconvenience of her past choices. But in the end, her cruelty had only brought our family closer together. Madison wasn't a liability to be hidden. She was the missing piece we'd never known we needed. As we sat down to dinner that Sunday, I looked around the table at my son, my grandson, and the granddaughter I'd gained through tragedy and truth. This wasn't the family Esme had tried to build through lies and manipulation. This was better. This was real. What would you have done if you were in my place? Have you ever faced something like this? Tell me what you think. I really want to know. Comment below.